Well, welcome. Just to begin real quick, I like to move around, so hopefully that doesn't bother anybody. Hopefully you can all hear me fine. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about the BrainGut Axis office. Unfortunately, Sue is going to come on after me, is going to speak a little bit more about the theoretical aspect, or excuse me, the clinical aspects of the BrainGut Axis. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the theoretical aspects. So it's more of a literature review of the BrainGut Axis. The BrainGut Axis has been pretty well established in neurodegenerative disease, especially when it comes to Parkinson's disease, but it hasn't really been discussed so much with concussion. So that's something that I'm going to show you today. All right. I was scared that we were gonna we did switch, didn't we? Let's try.
That's right.
We had switched, there we go, okay. The gut-brain axis is found, like I say, found to play a role in different neurodegenerative diseases, but the research in these, the autism, Parkinsonism, ALS, those diseases, it has been well established. So we're going to talk a little bit about, specifically, this slide is very interesting. 100 trillion microorganisms in our gut, which, you know, that sounds like a lot. 3 to 4 pounds of bacteria are the major categories that have been proposed. Is this slide right here shows you the different, it's called enterotyping. An article out of Nature a few years ago, they talked about enterotyping, which is, if you haven't heard of genotyping is the study of typing your genes and how your genes act and react. Well, now this landmark article came out and they discussed enterotyping, which is the study of your types of guts that you have, which obviously plays a big role in everything, because I'm going to show you today, I'm going to demonstrate today how the amount of inflammation that we have in our gene can actually directly impact our brain. Unfortunately, we can't go into a lot of detail on that today. We're going to use the terms microbiota and microbiome interchangeably today, so they're going to be synonymous. The functions of our microbiome, of course, as we know, is nutrient absorption, immune system function, production of vitamins, and of course CNS signaling, and I'm going to show you a little bit how that occurs. The gut's able to maintain homeostasis by immune system, so we have these cytokines that are released throughout our body in reaction to all the different foods that we have. We found out now that after a concussion, these cytokines are released as well. What was recently been determined or established is that what's happening in our gut is a direct reflection of what's happening in our brain and vice versa. And I'm going to explain to you how that happens. We have an endocrine system response, and Sue's going to talk a little bit to you about cortisol. But the endocrine system response, or the hormonal changes that occur after a concussion, hasn't nearly been studied, hardly at all. And so that's something that we hope that we get, will be researched here pretty soon. And then we have the nervous system along the vagus nerve. So this slide, the gut microbiome has been found to regulate immune action and both innate and adaptive immunity. In a recent study, one of the largest gene studies to date regarding sports-related concussion, in the first 6 hours, it was dominated by inflammatory activity. So the cytokines is going to be interleukin 6, interleukin 12, and the toll-like receptor. So this was a huge study, genetic study. The key here on this slide is the inflammatory disorders of the CNS, the mucosal, the intestinal community, and then we have the systemic, the peripheral immune system. So the peripheral immune system, one of the big arguments that we had when we started our saliva study following concussions was that the current cytokines in our peripheral immune system does not affect the cytokines in our brain. And that, of course, we have found that is not true. So, you know, the old expression, you are what you eat, that's true. The only problem is that we don't know where the breakdown occurs yet. We don't know where that breakdown occurs when somebody has concussions or those subconcussive hits and causes that inflammation in the brain. Important statement, this slide talks about the important statement regarding the impact of the microbiome has our immune system. So both of us are going to talk a little bit how it's a bidirectional pathway. It's like a highway. So one's going and one's coming and going. So they're delivering signals and taking signals away, and that is an important concept that we have to realize that in order to truly understand this brain-gut axis. CNS is able to shape our microbial community, and brain-gut axis likely acts as a causal relationship with neurodegeneration. That's a big statement, and I took that statement from an article that was just recently reported. This is a quick schematic that talks about, or shows you the semi-permeable lining of the gut. We think of our gut as being fully permeable or not semi-permeable, which means that we can actually leak things out of it, and Sue will talk a little bit about the leaky gut. On the right-hand side of the slide, you see that it talks about the kynurenic acid and the quinolinic acid. We just don't have time to get into that today, but that is a kind of a kickstart to the inflammatory process that occurs after a concussion or with a bad gut. This is another look or schematic at the brain-gut axis and the pathways involved. It's kind of a busy slide, but the one thing I like about it is it shows how the vagus nerve is in here, and it just kind of shows it's a nice little description of what I'm talking about today. I like this picture. It's one of my favorite pictures because it shows you the exact brain-gut axis. It takes out everything else. What I mentioned earlier, that bidirectional pathway, this is what this shows. So kind of think of it as, you know, you take all the other organs and all the other stuff away from it, and this is what you have. So increased evidence is identifying more and more correlation to neurodegenerative disease, not just GI disorders. Perturbations in this pathway not only have been found to be involved in sports-related or intestinal disorders, but also neurodegenerative disorders. And that's something that both Sue and I we have found to be very, those in the medical community have been they haven't been open to this very much at all, and we hope to change that. In fact, speaking with several sports medicine doctors, they're not aware of this brain-gut axis, and they have to be because it's very important. Once again, numerous authors identify regulation through immune, endocrine, and neurological systems. So this brain-gut axis not only responds from a physiological perspective through the vagus nerve, the neural pathway, but also through that immune and endocrine system pathways or systems. This talks about the top-down, bottom-up pathways, both from the scientific sports medicine perspective and the sports-related concussion perspective. The gut can directly affect I'm going to say this microglia. I don't know if you guys have been educated differently. I actually was watching a webinar a few months ago, and they actually pronounced it microglia. So I don't know how anyone in here were educated on that, but I'm just for the sake of today, I'm going to call it microglia. I actually looked it up in my medical dictionary, and it said both pronunciations were there. So I'm going to just go ahead and stay with the microglia. But the gut can directly affect the microglial activity. Now, we can't get into too much detail today because I could talk more and more about this, but the status of the microglia is an important concept to understand in the sports-related concussion. Not just mild traumatic brain injury, but also moderate severe traumatic brain injury. So this is a very, very important and impactful statement. What it's saying is that the gut can affect the inflammatory status, what we call the M1 phenotype of the microglia. This highlights the endocrine hormonal role of sports-related concussion. In a gene expression study a couple years ago, at the 7-day mark, they found that the transcription activity shifts from inflammation to regulation of the HPA axis, or the hypothalamic pituitary axis. Both Sue and I have gone into a lot of detail about this and a lot of research about this. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of research that involves sports-related concussion and the hormones. Everybody, obviously, hormones, everybody's hormones act a little bit differently, but the impact of how foods in our environment affect our hormones, and then the sports-related concussion. So I hope that here in the next few years, we'll have much more data on that HPA axis. This slide discusses the peptides and neuropeptides from our gut being identified from a sports-related concussion. One of the study that came out a couple years ago, they looked at what's called neuropeptides, and so how these neuropeptides are in our gut and how that was impacted the status of our brain and our microglia. This slide talks about another link to the gut, the inflammation and the immune system. It has a pro and anti-inflammatory responses from our gut. Research is showing neurodegeneration, that the gut lining becomes more permeable, and it talks about the blood-brain barrier. And I remember when I was going through college and school, they told us that the blood-brain barrier was this impenetrable fortress. It's not true anymore. A lot of research is showing now that blood-brain barrier is not the fortress we once thought. It is semi-permeable as well. And I'll show you here in a little bit that evidence shows, or research has shown, that blood-brain barrier opens after a sports-related concussion. So if that blood-brain barrier opens during a concussion, then of course that will allow the bacteria, not only bacteria to get in there, but also it can allow the cytokines, or those inflammatory proteins, to get past. What happens after, over time, to a semi-permeable gut is a process of dysbiosis, and the translocation of gut contents and the pathogens from our gut is a problem. And Sue's going to talk a little bit about the diet, hopefully, that will alleviate that or ameliorate that. This also elicits an immune response, or almost an autoimmune response. So this dysbiosis can cause a lot of problems. The gut also has epigenetic influences. The field of epigenetics, I don't know, just out of show of hands, how many in here has heard of the field of epigenetics? You know, in the old days when I was taught genetics, it was you're stuck. Your mom and dad, whatever your mom and dad gave it, you're stuck. Well, now what's been found is that our genes continually change to our environment. So if I go out and eat a hot dog, my genes are going to change. The one I talk about in class the most is caffeine. How are they affected with caffeine? I personally am not affected by caffeine, but there's probably a lot of you in here that need that cup of coffee. Okay, so that affects the genes. I can't be in the house when my mom makes Brussels sprouts or cauliflower or broccoli. I can't even be in the house hardly. So obviously we have a different epigenetic system. So clearly, when we get a concussion, or the foods that we eat can affect the epigenetics and therefore the inflammatory process. This quote here, this discusses the lymphatic pathway, and when I was on sabbatical, I kind of passed over this article because I didn't really think it was very important. And as I started reading it, it actually highlights how important this is from a neurological perspective. This lymphatic pathway was a huge breakthrough. It's a lymphatic system for the brain, and we talk about the lymphatic system. Of course, we all get, when we get sick, we check our lymph nodes. This is actual for the brain, so this is a huge breakthrough. Any studies that involve the brain should involve this lymphatic pathway. It has shown to be damaged in the acute phase of mild traumatic brain injury, and I'll talk about this lymphatic pathway ties in a little bit to the cellular degradation system that I'll mention here in a few minutes. Note the word perivascular in this slide. It's essentially, I hate to use this comparison, but it's like a sewer system for the brain. The second bullet discusses how it may be a bit premature, but definitely possible. This needs to be more research, but this talks about how the lymphatic system can be responsible for the aggregated proteins that occur in our brain during neurodegeneration. So we talk about misfolded proteins and aggregated proteins inside our brain with neurodegeneration. It's what the authors are saying in this is that the lymphatic pathway could be the reason for this. This is a nice little slide. Don't pay attention to the boxes because that gets a little bit busy and we can't go into detail today, but this is a great schematic or drawing of the immune system and the lymphatic system, the central nervous system, and the endocrine system working together. Okay, so this slide highlights the important and credible link between the gut and the brain. Examples of activation within our gut: pathogens, metabolites, chemicals. Glyphosate, for example. Glyphosate, if you guys don't know this, if you go use Roundup on your sidewalks in your driveway, glyphosate they actually put glyphosate on wheat and grains to desiccate it. There are numerous articles. I actually co-authored a study a couple years ago with probably the foremost glyphosate expert in the country out at MIT. Glyphosate, they did a study on just beers, for example, in Germany a couple years ago. 99% of the beers in Germany had glyphosate on it. So we eat, if you think that you're just putting Roundup in your house and you're not exposed to it, that's incorrect. You are being exposed to glyphosate all the time. Glyphosate actually has been shown to not only been involved in Hodgkin's and non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and other cancers, but also takes the place of glycine in the genes, and therefore causes an ALS type of condition. The M1 activated state of microglia is the state that we don't want. That is the inflammatory state, or the pro-inflammatory state. So when we get a concussion, or when our brains become more sensitive to concussions, either through the gut or the brain itself, a direct injury to the brain, it causes what's called an M1 phenotype, and that's where the microglia are putting out the inflammation. This is one of my favorite slides because it gives you a little bit of example of how kind of what happens with mild traumatic brain injury, but also some of the other triggers that's involved, or the epigenetics, if you will, the triggers that cause the inflammation in our brain. Well, that's the slide right there. I'm sorry. I got ahead. So this slide actually shows you the different triggers. The microglia, for example, I like this a light switch, so the different kinds of triggers, and you can see the different triggers and foods that can do that. The ability to control the brain inflammation secondary to microglia activation is the key to stopping this traumatic brain injury or this neurodegeneration. So that's one of the things that we're doing again with our saliva study. If we could figure out how to stop that inflammation, then we can go ahead and stop the neurodegeneration. The state of reactive or pro-inflammatory stimuli is what's unwanted. The majority of the studies now that are involved in sports-related concussion are basically searching for how the microglia can get active and how they can get out of that M1 phenotype. If we understand that a little bit better, then we can understand sports-related concussion, and not just the concussion, but the subconcussive hits. So this article was a big article that came out a couple years ago, and this one talked about the repeated, but not the single traumatic brain injury. Boston University just came out with a big study just this last year, and they talked about not the concussions, but those repeated hits. Those repeated subconcussive hits can actually cause the inflammation process in the brain and the microglia to become active. So that is an important concept. If I get asked all the time, would I let my kids play football? And the field of football, I don't want to get into too much detail of this because we're running out of time, but this is a very important personal decision between parents and kids, whether they want to keep their kids playing football, and not just football, but soccer as well. Numerous reports corroborate that these findings, the chronic microglia activation, leads to the pro-inflammatory status. So this is pretty well established in the literature. Dr. Blaylock was a trailblazer, and he talked about the word immunoexcitotoxicity and how a microglia become excited, or he coined it with immuno because it was an immune system reaction. So when we are exposed to all these different epigenetic factors in our environment, all these different things that cause inflammation, he called it immunoexcitotoxicity, which I think is a good word. So clearly the microglia, this slide kind of tells you a little bit, kind of shows you a little bit about the blood-brain barrier. Here's the brain and the semi-permeability of the gut. Once again, it also talks a little bit about short-chain fatty acids, and I won't get into detail about the short-chain fatty acids or the good fats, but the short-chain fatty acids is a way to improve the health of your gut. So we've established that the microglia are central players in this inflammatory process. Now I want to talk a little bit about in this one, research reports that autophagy might influence inflammation. Autophagy is what I mentioned earlier, is how the cells get rid of their, it's like a garbage disposal for our cells. Autophagy, is anyone here heard of autophagy, just out of curiosity? Okay, so if you want to get into some detail and start digging in the weeds a little bit, look up autophagy. Autophagy, in most neurodegenerative circles, this is the key to stopping neurodegeneration. So the autophagy system is, in fact, in twins, in ALS twins, they did a big study out of California a couple years ago, and they looked at autophagy and epigenetics, and their conclusions were that if autophagy is found early enough, if the neurodegeneration is found early enough, then autophagy actually ameliorated that situation. Been shown to have both beneficial and deleterious effects, and that's the key, is the timing. Controlling autophagy, once again, that is going to be the key. So this goes to the diagnostics, the diagnosis of neurodegenerative disease. When we have athletes, we have people that play sports, and they come up to us and they say that they're hurting or they're having problems. The thing that I instantly think about is, how can we stimulate autophagy? Unfortunately, we can't do anything yet. Medicine, or the field of medicine, hasn't been able to figure this out yet, but they will in a few years. This slide demonstrates that autophagy is noted after sports-related concussion, or what's called autophagic flux. So after a sports-related concussion, autophagy, this system, is affected. When people ask me about autophagy and about neurodegeneration, or CTE, what causes it and how do we fix it? It is not something that is unifactorial. It's multifactorial. There are many things going on. The blood-brain barrier, again, is not that fortress we once thought, and it is not immune privileged as we once believed. So once we have a concussion, the blood-brain barrier does open and does allow things inside. And this is another slide that just talks about, this is a busy slide. It talks about the different cells that make up the blood-brain barrier. But the word I want you to look at is the perivascular again. That's going to come into play here in a little bit. This slide, again, it just shows you, demonstrates what the blood-brain barrier kind of looks like. They're all just lined up in a row right there. And of course, I wish I had a slide that could show you that after a sports-related concussion or a mild traumatic brain injury, that does open up. In fact, a lot of medications can cause the blood-brain barrier to open up. Things like Adderall. Adderall is some medications that are CTE players or CTE sufferers take, and that opens up the blood-brain barrier, makes things worse. Okay, this study just showed that the blood-brain barrier does open after sports-related concussion. Once the blood-brain barrier opens, or does become semi-permeable, it allows the systemic pro-inflammatory cytokines and microbes in. All right, so this demonstrates the importance of that blood-brain barrier, and it does prove that that area is, or that wall is, semi-permeable. Well, I'm trying to figure out how to go into detail about this, but I better just keep it there. But they've studied some short-chain fatty acids, and how when the people in these studies took short-chain fatty acids, they actually resumed or restored the integrity of the brain parenchyma, which, in other words, it solved the situation. And that's a pretty important thing, because the fecal transplant, this is kind of gross to talk about, I understand that, but fecal transplants have been discovered or have been used in C. difficile infections for quite a few years now. And one of the things that I think is important to realize is that a fecal transplant could help these CTE sufferers and these neurodegenerative sufferers, because it decreases the inflammation in the gut. Research in recent years has shown that the microbiome has a profound effect on that barrier function. We have to start addressing this. This is an issue that has to be addressed, and I wish the clinical medicine and the clinical field would do that. Traumatic brain injury has been shown to increase intestinal permeability and the resultant loss of intestinal homeostasis. So what allows is bacterial translocation. So the bacteria in our gut or the bacteria in our blood system or in our systemic circulation can get past that blood-brain barrier inside our gut. Many, many, many studies have shown things like mycoplasma or Lyme disease in our brains. Okay, so that just that just demonstrates what I just said. The pathogens reaching in our brain, and they need eradication. Subconcussive hits. Again, we need to address the subconcussive hits as well. And there's that word perivascular again. There's a big study that came out about CTE a few years ago that showed the CTE, the very definition of CTE is in the perivascular regions of the brain. So if this is occurring, if this brain-gut axis is occurring at the perivascular level, there is a definite link that shows a definite link between the two. This is just demonstrates a peripheral immune response again in the cytokines that are there that get past the brain. So the health of our gut has a direct influence on inflammation. I hope that's the takeaway you take from this. This is the slide that I was just talking about. Doherty and colleagues found that CTE found in the perivascular regions of the brain. So I think there's definitely something there that needs to be studied extensively. These are just 3 different studies that talked about the neurodegeneration in the brain-gut axis. They're great studies. If you want them, I can get those for you. This study used germ-free mice to demonstrate that dysbiosis can result in greater blood-brain permeability. So we get things outside of the gut that can cause that blood-brain barrier to open up, and also mentions the short-chain fatty acids. This study talked about the 36 genes affected in all forms of traumatic brain injury, not just mild, but also moderate and severe. Most genes affected in mild traumatic brain injury are related to inflammation. That's also the other takeaway I want you to get from this today is the neuroinflammation that occurs. CT opens in our 2nd year of our saliva study. We've had pretty encouraging results. We're going to continue that through the next year in football and soccer players. Inflammation has been shown to hyperphosphorylate the tau, which is noted in CTE. And this is one of my favorite slides because it actually has just a flow chart to the inflammation and how that hyperphosphorylates the tau that's involved in CTE. This is the definition of CTE, and there's that word perivascular again. The results support the idea that at brain levels, several neurochemical mediators are important for neuronal function and influence the host microbiome. This just further emphasizes the point I'm making today, this theoretical component, this brain-gut axis. This used rats, in roundworms, which is kind of different to think about, but the roundworm actually has been used in studies before because they have similar nervous systems to humans. But they create amyloid. The bacteria in our gut create amyloid, which, as we know, is found in Alzheimer's disease. But it also has involved in the aggregation of other pathological proteins found in neurodegeneration. So it's a multi-hit process. It's a multifactorial process that leads to inflammation that phosphorylates or hyperphosphorylates the proteins involved in neurodegeneration. This talked about a mouse model. Use a mouse model showing the vagal stimulation of the absence of TBI did not cause increased intestinal permeability. So this just, again, further demonstrates this brain-gut axis after TBI. This ALS article came out a couple years ago, and they said they think that it's very possible that ALS starts in the gut.
Mike, could I throw a couple questions in?
Sure.
Great, and I don't mean to derail you, but...
This slide?
Not this slide,
oh.
But actually it's just cumulative. The implications of treating concussion or brain injury with treatments for the intestine, for the gut, for the microbiota.
Yeah.
Have you seen, is there any current literature on that, or is that a connecting of the dots that you think might be a promising practice?
No, so what Jeff just asked about is the, basically, if I'm getting this right, have there been any studies showing in patients with a mild traumatic brain injury, have they addressed the gut And there is, I don't know of any.
Okay.
I just knocked it. I wasn't supposed to do that. But no, I have not seen that.
But what I hear you saying is that it's a potentially promising practice, or at least worth looking at, because if you could restabilize or lower the inflammation in the gut, you would end up treating or lowering or ameliorating the brain injury.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I'm just
Yes.
trying to get my head around that.
Okay. Accumulating evidence. So here we have evidence supporting the role of microbes in neurodegeneration via that inflammatory pathway. Long-term neuronal damage. The damage from mild traumatic brain injury is not due to primary, this study talked about not due to primary injury. When we have mild traumatic brain injury, we talk, the studies have shown that they have this diffuse axonal injury, but this study showed that it's more due to secondary effects such as that continued inflammation. This slide just really quick shows you what a traumatic brain injury looks like, and it talks about the left, pay attention to the left hand of the slide, the right hand side of the slide is what happens with traumatic brain injury. It's not all inclusive, it doesn't show everything, but it certainly does show you what happens. We're not going to get into details with this because I'm finishing up here, but this is just an example of what, actually this interestingly enough, this slide came from a journal called Fly, where they use fruit flies to look at concussions. This is a flow chart that Sue and I have both put together. I don't know if you can see very well the arrows, but this just kind of shows you, it kind of sums everything up a little bit. How the, we have a head hit and all these things occur. And of course we have the microglial inflammation and the blood-brain barrier open. So there's this communication here, and then that leads further to the hyperphosphorylated tau and then the neurodegeneration. I'm finished. We'll save more questions at the end. Sue's going to take over. And I'm going to let the experts. Thank you.